distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. A warm welcome to the third session of the Academy of Sinology UWTSD's Sinology Art of Living seminars. We are honored and delighted to have you join us again on the second day of our seminars. Today's session will introduce the Academy's new bachelor's program taught in English. Just a friendly reminder, please have your camera turned off and microphone muted to prevent disruption during the presentations. First of all, please join me in welcoming the Provost of the Academy of Sinology, Venerable Sheng Miao, to provide an opening address for the seminar today. Provost, please.
Thank you, Xin Hui. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and students, it is my great honor to introduce the Academy's upcoming bachelor program that will be taught in English, which is the focus of this session. Although it is still to be validated, the university has assured me that I can share the news. Because some of you may be preparing for university next year. As we look ahead today, I'd like to take the time to first look back at the story behind the Academy. It begins over 90 years ago with a young boy who was fond of learning, who had deep questions about life and the world. But he was deprived of learning opportunities because his country was torn by war and conflict. It would be several years before he could attend normal schooling again. But those years of being a refugee who fled across several provinces on foot for safety, his thoughts turned to how we could create a better world, a world of peace and harmony. And that became his life's mission. Many of you will know that this is the story of the founder of the Academy, Venerable Master Chen Hong, who turned 95 this year. He has had a teaching career spanning 6 decades. He continued to inspire with his work on intercultural and interfaith harmony, a vision in which all religions and all cultures learn from one another for a future of a mutual understanding and harmony, a future free of war and conflict. Based on personal experience and his lifetime's work, Venerable Master explains that by understanding the Chinese cultural heritage, the ancient wisdom not only serves to benefit ourselves individually, our families, and our organizations, but also promote national prosperity and global harmony. To this end, Venerable Master has established schools and foundations around the world. He has also actively preserved the textual tradition as a cultural heritage for all humanity. For about 20 years, Venerable Master has invested millions in reprinting the complete library of the 4 branches of Chinese literature, the largest collection of text in the history of China and other collections. He has donated hundreds of copies to major universities, national libraries, and cultural institutes for the benefit of learners today and for safekeeping for the generations of tomorrow. But one day, while visiting one of the universities in the UK that had received the complete library. Venerable Master asked if a student had read the books. To his surprise, the answer was no. He then realized that while preservation of the text was important, there was even more urgency in nurturing young minds to study this text. Professors who had the classical training in interpreting this text were already in their 70s and 80s, and they needed to empower young people to be able to read the text for themselves, to continue to research, advance, and share the wisdom to improve lives and alleviate suffering in today's world. Studying and sharing the good ideas and insights in this treasure trove is not the job of one person. Vice-Chancellor Professor Madeline Hughes shares in Venerable Master Chen Gong's vision, and that is why the Academy was established as a part of the University of Wales Trinity St. David. The Academy is a joint project of the university under the Chen Hong Multicultural Education Foundation, and it is dedicated to training young people to bring the wisdom in these ancient texts to the contemporary world. The new degree program is a milestone as we advance towards this aim. The traditional Chinese culture is centered on education. The earliest Chinese writings on education in the records of a rite, of a ritual, states that the ancient kings, in establishing their kingdoms and governing their people, prioritized teaching and learning. Why was education important? For everyone, from the state ruler to common people. The popular children's primer called The Three-Character Classic explained in its opening that at the outset, human nature is good, similar by nature, distinct by habit. At the very essence, human nature is fundamentally that of utmost goodness, untainted by even the dual notions of good or bad. Of course, we come into this world with different capacities, and even where we are born set us apart. But our innate potential for moral excellence is the same. The question then is, how do we realize this potential? The next line answers our question. Without education, human nature deviates. That is why education is so important. Because without education, we are unable to realize our potential. This is the education of wisdom and humanity, an education that helps us distinguish kindness from unkindness, such that we cultivate humanity and learn how to care for others. An education through which we understand timeless principles, and an education that transforms our lives. This is what we hope to achieve at the Academy. You will now hear about the subject from the teaching staff. The offerings are largely based on our current bachelor program, which is mostly taught in Chinese. Our current programs have prerequisites in Chinese language skill, classical Chinese comprehension, and the knowledge of philology, which present difficulties for students who have only started to develop an interest in the Chinese tradition. The subjects chosen are fundamental to classical training and integrate practical elements that will help you apply learning to daily life. I would like to conclude this opening address with a challenge. I challenge you to look forward with two questions. First, what will be your legacy to this world? Second, how will you empower yourself to realize this? Thank you.
Thank you to the Provost for his insightful words. This now brings us to the lecture program with 5 talks organized for this session. For the first session, we'll invite Dr. Catherine No, who spoke in yesterday's seminar. Dr. No completed her doctorate in Sinology this year. The area of her research was traditional elementary education, so she will be introducing the subject of children's literature. Thank you, Dr. No.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I'm very honored to be able to share with you a topic that I'm very passionate about, which is children's literature in pre-modern China. And this is actually going to be one of the subjects in the new BA program. Children's literature, these texts, was a specific, unique genre designed for the first stages of education in pre-modern China. Because they were educational texts, they were intricately connected with the traditional educational philosophy. So the very first question that I'd like to address is, what were the aims of education at that time? Now, the most direct statement of these educational aims comes from the practice of the mean in the opening passage. And it talks about how education is essentially cultivating the way. Cultivating the way means that we try to follow our innate nature, recover this innate nature. And this innate nature is actually imparted by the ultimate reality. In other words, education is about realizing our innate potential, recovering our innate nature. But it's not simply about us. It's actually about helping everyone or things fulfill their potential too, because the way, what it means is that it's a natural order in which all things, events, and people flourish. So it's a way of creating a flourishing throughout the world. So education is very holistic when you think of the traditional philosophies. Now, you can see, of course, that this education has equal parts in terms of nature and nurture. So both nature and nurture play a very vital role. And that leads us to a very common metaphor that's used to describe education in Chinese writings. This one comes from one of the earliest Chinese essays on education in the Records of Ritual, which talks about how it's like a piece of raw jade. This raw jade needs to be cut and polished before it realizes its worth as a sacred vessel or a valuable gemstone. And similarly, us as humans, we have this innate greatness, this innate goodness, but we require education to fully realize it. So that's this idea of nature, this utmost goodness that we have inside of us, but the need for nurture as well. And this was also very inherent in childhood education. So one of the underlying principles throughout Chinese history in terms of elementary education comes from the changes, in which it talks about how we need to nourish the correct nature of young children. And this correct nature is none other than the innate nature, or this innate potential that the Provost also mentioned. If we are able to realize this, then we become a sage. So childhood education was very much a part of the entire educational journey and this idea of cultivating the way. Now, the next question is, yes, we understand the aim, but how do we do this? How does the nourishing, how does the cultivating occur? Well, actually, education of young children, this topic of research actually stretches back to as early as the 2nd century in China. And it occurred because the early Han Dynasty rulers were trying to learn the lessons from the Qing Dynasty. So what happened was that Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of the Qing Dynasty, he conquered the other states and united China, creating the first Chinese empire. However, his dynasty collapsed after nearly 15 years. The next dynasty, the Han Dynasty rulers, wanted to learn from his mistakes. And as they thought about, what were the causes of the, rises and collapses of dynasties, they came back to this idea of the attributes of the ruler, how to create the best ruler. Court advisors then increasingly turned to the importance of educating the princes, such that the princes would eventually become wise and benevolent sovereigns who could preserve the imperial power. So the search for the point at which an individual's character was formed, this character was very important because they believed that it would determine future good fortune or misfortune, not just for the individual, but if this individual was a ruler, that would mean good fortune or misfortune for the state. The search increasingly turned to younger and younger years and into childhood. And so that's when they started thinking more about childhood education. So at this period in time in the Han Dynasty, there were mainly 3 views on childhood education. And these are detailed in Anne Kinney's text, seminal text on Chinese views of childhood. So first of all, that the child's nature was malleable and it required education for full development. Now that's what we talked about before, the need for education. However, this malleability, we were malleable, but only to a certain extent, because the more we aged, the more set in our ways we would become, and our habits would become more ingrained. And that's why we have the expression in English, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And therefore, the early Chinese also identified that the phase of nurture was limited. This led to the 3rd view, which was that education needed to start as early as possible. And they started in this time talking about even education of the child in the womb, prenatal education, because they believed, and as science tells us today, early impressions last. So the Emperor Wen of the Han Dynasty, who's pictured here, was advised by his court official, Jia Yi, who quoted Confucius, saying that habits formed in childhood become like second nature. They're so ingrained, we just do it instinctively. And this particular quote is recorded not just in Jia Yi's new writings, it's also recorded in the history of the former Han. So these 3 ideas or views of childhood education were sanctioned by the Han Dynasty government and would become the mainstay for childhood education in the East. These 3 views were actually the main principles underlying the compilation of children's literature. So here is a modern day compilation or anthology of children's primers called Becoming a Sage. Essentially, the most popular sort of titles of these primers in the past. But as we'll look at later, authors of these texts parents, educators were really keen that education began as soon as possible. And when we talk about education, you have to remember we're talking about cultivating the way. So it wasn't simply reading and writing. So they wanted to start it as soon as possible so that children could get a good start to life. So whilst the children read these texts, not only did they learn how to read and write, but also they learned about culture, history, values, philosophy, historical figures, etc. Now, it's interesting because the content of these primers is actually no different from what the children would later read, the actual classics, historical texts, and other literary works. But it was just packaged differently. Now, what do I mean by this? Let me give you an example. I remember when I was 8 years old, my parents bought the Encyclopedia Britannica. And I remember coming home from school and seeing that almost one wall of the study room was full of these black, thick volumes of the encyclopedia. Now, this was in those days before the Encyclopedia Britannica could be bought on CD or internet. So they bought the paper version. Now, they were told that if they bought the Britannica, they could also get the children's Britannica at a discount price. So they bought that too. And I remember the children's Britannica, I was immediately drawn to it. It was red. Also, it only took up 2 shelves and was much thinner and smaller. And so I started with reading the children's Britannica. The entries were much smaller. The language was simpler. But the great thing was that all of the important facts were there. So you weren't missing out on too much. And that's exactly how these traditional primers are, in the sense that they provide the essence of traditional learning. The other thing that they do really well is that it's not just educational, it's also entertaining, because yes, the vocabulary is simpler, the sentences are shorter, but they also rhyme, and it makes it really readable. So in the world history of children's literature, there's often a dichotomy between books that are educational and books that are entertaining. But the ancient compilers, they struck a balance in creating entertaining and also educational texts. So these various primers can be further classified into the different functions that they fulfilled. Some primers were more focused on developing the child's literacy. Some were mainly geared towards teaching them sort of daily etiquette. There were some that were provided allusions that the children would need when they composed poetry or essays for the exams, proverbs, as well as learning history. So there were a range, and I've only just provided some examples here. There are many, many more. But what I'd like to do now is to sort of look inside some of these texts so that you can get an idea of the fact that these texts are really special. They're very rich in the educational content, but also the strategies they use to be able to convey this information to the young child. So the first one I'll look at is the very popular 3-character classic. Now, this text was compiled in the 13th century and thereafter was read by almost every literate person as the very first book that they read until the very end of Imperial China. Now, it's called the 3-character classic because, as you can see, these large characters here, that's the text. The text is arranged in 3-character phrases. So this particular page we'll look at now, it talks about a real person in history, Dou Yujun, and he's known as Dou of the Swallow Hills because that's where he lived. And it's also a respectful term of address to call someone not by their full name, but by the place that they lived. So it says here, Dou of the Swallow Hills used the right method. His family was acclaimed as 5 sons were well taught. Now, this story comes from the 9th century, and Dou Yujun was a scholar official. His story was that by the age of 30, he didn't have any children, which was quite late for people of those times. And more importantly, he was very concerned that, that the continuation of the family line was threatened. Now, one night he has this dream, and he dreams of his late grandfather, who tells him that it's actually because in his past life, he committed many misdeeds. And therefore, in this life, he's not able to have any sons and also have a short lifespan. However, his grandfather encourages him by saying that if he's able to cultivate, if he's able to perform charitable deeds, he may be able to change his destiny. So Dou Yujun becomes really dedicated and committed to turning over a new leaf. He actually cultivates himself and performs countless numbers of kind acts. For example, providing financial assistance to people who couldn't afford funerals. He also established over 40 schools for providing free education for the needy. And he did all of these without seeking any reward or recognition. So his cultivation was successful. He later had 5 sons, as we can read here, and all of them actually achieved or passed the highest levels of the imperial examinations and went on to have very successful careers in government, which is really impressive given that all 5 of them were able to do so. Here talks about the fact that he used the right method. And this was a line used because this family was so acclaimed that the chancellor at the time, Feng Dao, wrote a poem in tribute to this family. And in this poem, he talks about how Dou Yujun used the right method, this idea of family education. Now, this term, Yi Fang in Chinese, right method, is actually an allusion to a line from one of the Confucian classics, the Zuo commentary to the Spring and Autumn Annals. And it's an account about Duke Zhuang of the state of Wei, who actually spoils one of his sons. And as a result, his senior minister tries to remonstrate with him, telling him that if one loves their children, they have to teach them in the right way. In other words, they have to regulate them, have to show them what is important, not just give them whatever they want. So in terms of Dou Yujun, how did he teach his children? Well, first of all, by his own example. He was, as we heard before, cultivating very conscientiously. The other way was that because many of the family funds went to charitable acts, the family grew up quite frugally. And then because of that, they knew to always think of others before themselves. The third way was that he ensured that all his children were very disciplined and that they cultivated as well, this idea of cultivating the way. So you can see, of course, that in just 2 lines, very simple lines, there's a wealth of learning and information that's being conveyed. So I've listed some different ideas here. First of all, the child not only learns new vocabulary, they also learn about literary Chinese, these terse sort of 3 character phrases, the grammar and the structures, and certain sort of literary Chinese terms. Also the idea of terms of respect, how he's not titled Dou of the Swallow Hills rather than being named Dou Yujun in this particular line. We hear about Dou and his background, but also there are a number of literary links. So his story is found in the historical records. We also learn about Feng Dao's poem and then the Zhuo commentary as well. But on top of all of this sort of, you could say, literary and linguistic learning, the children also learn about values, like the parent and child relationship. What's the role of the parent? Yes, the parent is meant to be compassionate, but the parent has to also teach the child and show them the right way. So if your parents might seem harsh sometimes, well, actually, maybe they are trying to tell you what's right and what's wrong. So this is very valuable educational philosophy that the children also learn through these two simple lines. So that's just, 2 lines from the 3-character classic. Let's now turn to the ritual etiquette primers. And there are many, but I've just picked out 2, Guidelines for Being a Good Person and Essentials of Daily Etiquette. The Guidelines for Being a Good Person was compiled in around 17th century. It was very popular. Similarly, the Essentials of Daily Etiquette is an even more contemporary text compiled in the 1980s, but both actually draw from the ancient ritual canon, as we'll talk about later. So this passage from the Guidelines for Being a Good Person is situated in the home life. So what do we do at home? What's some home etiquette? In terms of how children relate to their parents, it says here that we as children should make sure that our parents are warm in the winter and cool in the summer. In the morning, we should greet them and show them that we care. And at night, make sure that they rest comfortably. Interestingly, this particular idea is also reiterated in the Essentials of Daily Etiquette, albeit in a very abbreviated form. It says here, in the morning and at night, make sure our parents are settled and well rested respectively. So these 2 similar ideas actually derive from the records of ritual. So as you can see here, it talks about how the ritual etiquette of children: first, warm the bed in winter, cool it in summer. Now this first part is really addressing the idea of, seasonal changes in the temperature, which require you, I guess, I'm sure all of us have had this experience, when it's winter, you take out the thicker bedding, warmer clothes, warmer shoes, etc. And this is what they had to do in the past as well. So this idea of seasonal changes, helping around in the house, the parents shouldn't have to ask the children to do this. As soon as we feel cold or we feel extra hot, then we should be considerate and sensitive that other people in the household feel the same way, and voluntarily change the bedding and help with getting out the different clothes and other things, making sure that our parents remain warm and cool in summer accordingly. Now, this is about sort of considering our parents throughout the year in these sort of household chores, and I guess in a way being sensitive of them when we consider ourselves. So the second idea is more on a daily basis. It says, settle parents into bed in the evening and ask of their health in the morning. This idea of settling parents into bed is actually sort of just like tucking them in the sense. And it makes me think of how parents tuck in their children. But as children, we should do that for our parents. And if you've ever done so before, it's a very good feeling, because you sort of know that that person is settled and ready for a good night's sleep. But part and parcel of this is not just going through the motions, it's also the final check, making sure that there's nothing on their mind as they go to bed, so that they can have a good night's sleep. If they're worried about something, thinking about something, still angry about something that's happened during the day, then they need to let it out. And so that's sort of that final check before they go to bed. And then in the morning, asking whether they had a good rest. Now, why is this important? Because what happens at night is often a good general indicator of our health. So bodily aches and pains tend to come out at night when our mind is unoccupied. And that is a good check on how things are happening physically in the body, but also mentally, because if we're worried about something, that often affects our sleep as well. So as children, you can see how the care and attention has to be meticulous. There's this attention to detail that is needed in looking after someone. And you can see that, actually these are actions that our parents have done for us at night and in the morning and, throughout the years when we were younger as well. So you can see that, just a very simple sentence actually has such depth of meaning. And if we are able to train ourselves, the sooner we train these interpersonal skills, empathy skills, the better that we'll be in all our other interpersonal interactions. So this is, again, just canvassing and thinking about all of the different kind of strategies and ways of learning that you can attain from just these 2 lines. First of all, vocabulary. As a young child reading these primers, you're learning a vocabulary at the same time. Literary Chinese, because, for example, something like the Way is also in a 3-character phrase structure. Then there's the literary links. So wasn't made up. It was actually something that was taken from the actual classics. And then, more importantly, these values. So what is expected in the parent-child relationship? And what does family reverence actually mean? How does a child show this? So these are the values that the child takes away from just 2 lines. And then, more importantly, after understanding this, applying it in one's daily life. So the ritual etiquette kind of primers were more applied in the sense that you could actually read it and do it. And the final primer that I'd like to share with you is this one from around the 17th century as well, called The Treasury of Elementary Learning. This particular text is much more voluminous. Essentially, it's a collection of literary allusions, and it was used so that children would be more acquainted with this, so that they would be able to write poetry and essays later during their exams. So we'll look at 2 very common idioms that are even used today. The first is casting away brick to attract jade. Now, we call these sort of idioms because they are used today in the sort of 4-character expression, but actually they're classical allusions because they actually allude to stories or people in the past. So this story is about, it comes from the 9th century, and it's about 2 poets. So one who's more sort of, who doesn't have much of a reputation, Chang Jian, and he finds out that Zhao Gu, who's a much more renowned poet, is coming to visit a nearby temple. So what he does is he visits the temple first, and he writes the first few lines of a poem, knowing that when the better poet comes along, he's sure to finish it off. And that's exactly what happens. So people refer to Chao Jian, the first poet's actions, as casting away brick to attract jade. So this brick represents the idea of one's own sort of poor abilities and sort of using these abilities to appeal or attract to people with more valuable contributions. So this particular idiom is still used today as an expression of humility, to say that, here I am just offering my own, a few ideas, opinions that are actually really worthless, but I'm doing it in the hopes that someone much better will come out and provide their valuable feedback and ideas and abilities. So this particular idiom is very interesting. Now, the second one, buying the casket and returning the pearls, is an allusion from Master Han Fei, this particular text. And it's about a person who sells pearls, but he sort of puts them in these really amazing caskets. So the casket is made out of magnolia wood, scented with cedar and laurel, decorated with small gems, and stitched with greenish blue feathers. And what happens? The people buy it, they keep the casket and return the pearls. So this particular story and this saying highlights the fact that, you know, a person has poor judgment. They can't even recognize something as valuable as a pearl. So it's used these days to talk about how someone has poor judgment or wisdom, not distinguishing what is actually valuable. So again, you can see that in these lines, the student is not only learning language, so the idioms, the sort of 4-6 kind of writing here, but also, more importantly, the underlying values. So this idea of humility, and in using this particular expression, if you wanted to express that humility. And then the second one, the idea of having wisdom and judgment to distinguish what is valuable, what is worthy. So these are also very important values that are being conveyed beyond what we saw before about just simply interpersonal relationships. So I'd like to end now with a quote from a renowned scholar official of the 18th century, Chen Hong Mo. And Chen Hong Mo was actually a very amazing philanthropist as well. So it's said that he established over 700 charitable schools from the prefecture to the county level. And he compiled this source book of childhood education as guidelines for family members and also teachers at his schools. And so this quote comes from the source book. It's actually at the very beginning, in which he talks about his ideas, but also these traditional ideas on education. He says, learning is learning to become human. There is no one in the world who is without relations, and thus all learning is that of human relations. And then he talks about how there's Jules's Academy and the core curriculum thoroughly covers the essentials of cultivating the self, handling affairs, and interacting with others. And there's nothing else. So you can see how the idea of education in the past was not simply that of reading, writing. Yes, they needed to develop literacy, but there was so much more, including these values at the heart of the cultural tradition and how to relate with others. So I guess, you know, the children's literature provides us with a really entertaining shortcut to the greater literary tradition. And, you know, it's really my hope that these valuable and timeless stories and their values can be made available to international audiences so that they too can grow up with these ideas, with this wisdom, and start their journey to realizing their innate potential as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine, for giving us an insight into the richness and depth of children's literature. Next, we'll invite Catherine again and Kelly, who has also just completed her doctorate in Sinology, to introduce to us the 4 books of Confucian learning. These texts were read by every literate Chinese for almost 600 years.
Thank you. I'll just get this PowerPoint ready. So Kelly and I will be presenting on this. Really wonderful to be able to present you on the 4 books. Kelly and I will be sharing with you. Basically, I'll start with talking about the significance of the 4 books in relation to the Confucian canon. And Kelly will be providing you with a taste of what these 4 books are like by covering key passages, interesting passages in these texts. So first of all, what are the 4 books of Confucian learning? They are the highest learning, the Analects, the Mencius, and the practice of the mean. So yes, as I'll talk about later, they were very important in the past, but why are they important today? Well, actually, they provide us with a foundation to the classics, the canonical works. And it's not only the 4 books, but the classics that provide us with timeless perspectives and insights for our lives today. So the 4 books are actually part of a very long established tradition of classic texts in China. And actually, from a global perspective, there are many other civilizations around the world who have a tradition of identifying a body of texts that have timeless principles, have authority and significance, which other civilizations might call wisdom literature, sacred texts, or simply classics as well. So you might have heard of the Homeric poems for the Greeks, the Vedas in Hinduism, the Quran for the Islams, the Holy Bible for the Christians, and the Pali Canon for the Theravada Buddhist tradition.
Okay, bye-bye.
So in Chinese history, the classical tradition originates from even before the times of Confucius. But it was particularly when Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty decreed Confucian thought as the state ideology that he particularly singled out 5 works known as the 5 classics. And he also established official teaching positions so that the government could be instructed with the learnings of the 5 classics. An imperial academy was also founded to transmit and expound on these texts. And it was a requirement that anyone who wanted to join the government public service needed to be proficient in interpreting and explaining these 5 classics. So the 5 classics were the Changes, the Documents, the Odes, the Spring and Autumn Annals, and the Ceremonial Rituals. So these texts were so important that they were standardized and inscribed in stone. This is an artifact from that period, and they were placed in the entrance of the Imperial Academy. Now, what was so special about these classics, about these texts? Why was it that they were called classics? Well, in Chinese, the 5 classics are termed Wu Jing. So what I'd like to do now is explore this particular character, Jing, so that we might be able to understand more about why it was called Jing and what it means. So there's 2 ways of exploring the character. First through its form, first through its sound, and then through its form. So first through the sound, Jing sounds like a near homophone to another character here, Jing, which literally means a straight or direct path. And that's why the philosopher Xunzi claimed that these texts, Jing, were seen as the best route to the original teachings of the ancient sages as transmitted by Confucius. Now, because the word Jing, by extension, conveys a verbal sense of passing through, then it also implies that the content of these texts has withstood the test of time. Now, let's move on and look at the form. So, according to the Shuowenjiezi, this particular character originally meant weaving. So, Jing meant weaving. And you can see that on the left is actually the character for silk. So, this yarn, it's meant to look like yarns of silk, like as you can see in the photo here. But in particular, it was meant to connote this idea of the warp threads in weaving. So, what are the warp threads in weaving? The warp threads are actually the longitudinal threads that you can see here. And they are the ones that are first spun before the weft threads, the horizontal threads, are threaded through, as you can see with the lady doing so here. So the warp threads are constant. And so therefore it implies that these particular texts carry constant principles. Now, because it's originally sort of defined as weaving, it also relates to the view that the 5 classics are also integrally connected texts. They provide a system of thought, and they weave together these constant principles that underlie the fabric of society and the cosmos. So, you can say that the content of the text was such that they had carried these constant timeless principles. Now, not surprisingly, the original set of 5 classics were further supplemented by other texts that also met the criteria. So there was a total of 13 classics by the 12th century. Now, these works formed the core curriculum for anyone who wanted to join government service and provided an important source of imperial authority. Now, how is it that the 4 books relate to the 13 classics? As getting back to the topic of the 4 books. Well, actually, they're quite integrated. So as you can see here, the Analects and the Mencius are there, and the practice of the mean was actually the 31st chapter of the Records of Ritual, whilst the highest learning was the 42nd chapter. So the 4 books are actually already part of the 13 classics. But what happened? Why were they singled out? The philosopher Zhu Xi was the person who published these 4 texts together for the first time, along with his interlinear commentaries in 1190. And this is what he has to say as to why he did it. He says, all things in the world have principle. Now, principle is a Neo-Confucian concept, talking about how everything in the world has this underlying sort of essence or substance, which he calls principle. So everything in the world has this principle, but its essence is embodied in the works of the sages and worthies. So he's referring to the classics. However, for brevity, accessibility, simplicity, and practicality, the writings of the highest learning, Analects, Practice of the Mean, and Mencius are unsurpassed. In other words, Zhu Xi believed that he had found a subset of the 13 classical texts that could constitute an effective core or foundation of the curriculum. And he believed that these 4 texts promised direct access to the minds of the greatest sages in the past. So full of meaning to him, so full of meaning were they to him that he actually worked on these texts for about 40 years of his life. And it said that in his traditional biography, that in the last few days of his life, he was still revising the commentary to the highest learning. His dream was realized on a national level after his death, when the imperial government in the 14th century decreed that the 4 books would be the compulsory curriculum for the civil service examinations. And this was designed to select government officials. Now, this continued for the next almost 600 years in imperial China. The 4 books really were, you could say, the core and the central texts of the Confucian tradition in late imperial China. In short, no text had greater power of presence in late imperial China than these 4 texts. And there are interesting parallels when you think of Europe, sort of early modern and medieval Europe, where the Bible also held this sway, so much so that any literate person in Europe would have common knowledge, assumed knowledge of the Bible. And this is what it was like for the 4 books in China. But the 4 books was not only studied by the Chinese. So in the late 16th century, when Jesuits, an order of the Catholic Church, came to China to try to preach about the Word of God, they also realized that these 4 texts were very popular. And because they needed to immerse themselves in the culture, they also started studying these seminal texts of the Confucian tradition. They not only studied these texts, they also translated them. So as you can see here, this is a Latin translation that is being said to be the accumulation of several decades of the Jesuit translations. And it includes the translation to the highest learning, the practice of the mean, and the Analects, along with detailed commentary. This was published in 1687. And the work was so well received in Europe that abridgments in French and English became widely available. And since then, the texts, the 4 books, have been translated into various other international languages, and there are now many English translations. I've put a picture here of James Legge because he's so important in the translation history of these texts. So he was the very first to provide sort of scholarly translations of the texts. So the 4 books, as we can see, have evolving significance throughout the history of China. And today, as China seeks to revive its cultural heritage, the 4 books are becoming even more important. For us, as we seek to understand this cultural heritage, there's really no better starting point than the 4 books. So now I'd like to hand over to Kelly, who will provide you with a taste of what these 4 books are like. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Just share my slides. I thought it might be interesting to have a look at what the 4 books say. I've heard a little bit about 4 books already, and what we'll do now is we'll explore one passage from each of the 4 books. So the title of this talk is 4 passages from the 4 books. Now, in no particular order, the highest learning, as Catherine mentioned, actually provides the framework and strategies for cultivating our ethical character. And in the highest learning, we find a passage that relates to King Tang, who's depicted here, King Tang of the Shang dynasty. And this is sort of in the earliest periods of Chinese history. As you can see, King Tang founded the Shang dynasty. He ruled during the 15th century before the Common Era. I have a little timeline here where you can see the Shang dynasty as being one of the what's known as the 3 dynasties in ancient China. Now, there's a passage. The passage relates to the basin inscription of King Tang. If you think about it, the objects that we use, everyday objects like the mirror or the desk lamp here, they have a specific purpose. But the ancients would try to use their everyday objects to remind themselves to cultivate their ethical character. And King Tang, he had these lines inscribed and they probably used on a regular basis. The inscription states, truly new each day, new every day, again new each day. Probably sounds rather repetitive. Now, the lines are actually about making our intentions sincere. And that's one of the first steps in cultivating our ethical character. Now, in the next slide, we have a modern replica of what the basin and the inscription might have looked like. So they have 3 lines, truly new each day, new every day, again, new each day. And they actually relate to 3 stages. You can think of them as 3 stages. The first stage is actually, most difficult. And the reason is because we have to be brutally honest with ourselves. We have to try to identify our faults and shortcomings. And some people will already be aware of their faults. And they can sometimes be slow in doing anything about those faults. The idea here is to identify, maybe list out the areas where you want to work on, and then pick out the worst. That way, we can get the most satisfaction out of correcting that fault, and it might make the others easier to tackle. So that probably sounds a little bit abstract. Use an example. Think about learning a new language. There's a range of skills to master, from speaking, reading, listening, and writing. And some people find that their speaking skills are actually the slowest to improve. And this might be because, it's fine when we're talking in front of a mirror, but when we're talking with others, it can sometimes feel awkward and embarrassing. We're worried, are we getting the words right, the pronunciation, can people actually understand us? So, but not to worry, the highest learning provides us with a good strategy. And the strategy is that we treat each day, we might be a little bit embarrassed sometimes when we're trying to learn a new language. The strategy is that we treat each day as a fresh start. It's a new day, after all, and we think about just getting our message across. We're not all interested in what happened yesterday or how other people might have reacted in the past. If we change and improve ourselves, well, others around us are bound to respond differently. So we try not to carry yesterday's emotional baggage. So that's the first step. Then the second stage, new every day, is when we've made some progress, we then have to keep up the momentum, a bit like in this Newton's cradle. So, look, we start afresh, not just on a daily basis, but we can start afresh on a moment-to-moment basis. If we didn't get something right before, well, we can try to erase that memory and start over. It's best not to have extraneous thoughts like, I'm never going to get better, it's too hard, people will laugh at me. We can choose to just start anew and not to stop until we get it just right. So now, probably sounds simple, intuitive, but people often have a lot of noise in their heads that slows them down and puts up unnecessary barriers for themselves. So that's new every day. And then third stage is, again, new each day. And this is about getting to the finish line and really achieving our goal. And this has to happen every day. We want to try to make progress with each day. And that's the magic of the words of the basin inscription of King Tang. And we can emulate King Tang by putting our own reminders in the places that we might look most. So that's the passage from the highest learning. Now, the next passage comes from we need to be reminded. The next passage actually comes from practice the meaning. And it's widely considered to be the most philosophical of the 4 books. It delves into the processes of self-cultivation. These lines here provide us with a bit of a mindset. Confucius said, "The archer is like the exemplary person. If they fail to hit the mark, hit the target, they seek the cause within themselves." Now here, Confucius likens self-cultivation, the cultivation of our ethical character, to the traditional art of archery. Now, archery was one of the 6 arts that was essential learning in the past. And the 6 arts included rice, music, archery, driving, literacy, and mathematics. So in the past, Chinese used archery for hunting, sport, ritual ceremony, even examinations, and warfare. Now, it was important not only to hit the target, but also to shoot the arrow with the correct form and conduct. Okay. Now, if a person misses the target, and as you can imagine, it takes a lot of mental focus and concentration, and if they happen to miss the target, well, the archer is between them and the target. You really can't blame anyone else. And you certainly shouldn't try to resent others who might be more skillful. But what can you do? The exemplary person would reflect on themselves and, keep on practicing. As they say, practice makes perfect. And the exemplary person here is sort of likened to the archer because they practice their virtues like humanity, so love and care for others. And people will naturally love and care for them. But let's say they come across someone who's unreasonable. Well, that's a bit like when the arrow fails to hit the target. And what does the exemplary person do? Well, they try to reflect and think about, well, have I maybe inadvertently, unintentionally caused offense or been inconsiderate to that person? or maybe to others in the past. We can be quite busy during our days. There's lots of work to do, and we can be, careless. Happens to everyone. And look, if we've made that sort of a mistake in the past, we've been unreasonable ourselves, well, obviously, we can try to apologize and simply not make the same mistake. Now, if we haven't been in the wrong at all, we can still try to take extra care not to make the same mistake. So, like the basin inscription before, this short quote sort of offers us a mindset for everyday resilience. Okay, and the next passage comes from there. So we find the words an example of Confucius, one of the most exemplary teachers of all time. And his pedagogy here sort of challenges our ideas about traditional education. Confucius said, "I do not enlighten anyone who is not eager to comprehend, or help out anyone who is not anxious to explain. When I've presented one corner of a subject and they cannot learn the other three from it, well, I do not repeat my lesson." Well, this passage is about our teaching and learning. It explains that the teacher should pace, or Confucius would pace his lessons according to the individual student's progress. And, learning is not simply rote learning, and teaching is certainly not blindly imparting knowledge. Confucius here illustrates that the teacher has to consider the needs of the situation or the circumstances of each student. You have sort of the type 1 students who has put in a lot of effort into their learning, but they haven't fully understood. So Confucius would explain the principles to them. Then you have sort of type 2 students. They've understood, but they have trouble putting it into the words. So Confucius would help them articulate their insights. And then you have the other students, the last category, where they haven't been able to extrapolate the meaning. And so Confucius does not repeat his lesson. What that means is he doesn't repeat the same teaching method. He will try to explain using different examples, other analogies, or wait for a better opportunity. So now all of these, the first two techniques involve sort of timely motivation for the students. And sort of this passage illustrates that the teacher sort of waits for the students to seek to want to know. They're ready to know, and they might be unable to explain before the teacher imparts their teaching. And from the perspective of the learners, well, Confucius is telling us here to really think about the material. How do we know if we've really understood? Do we ask questions where we haven't understood? Can we put it into our own words? And have we fully digested? And we engage whether we've understood, if we can infer the other three corners. For example, if we've learned how to use a tool like a screwdriver, maybe to tighten the screw in the kitchen, well, actually, you realize that you can actually use the same screwdriver to tighten screws elsewhere in the house. Those sorts of realizations, as an example, maybe. So Confucius is sort of teaching his students to think creatively and not simply learning by rote. And last but not least, passage from the Mencius. This passage offers us a bit of a wake-up call. Now suppose, Mencius says, that there is a person whose fourth finger is bent so that it cannot be straightened. This may be neither painful nor incapacitating, and yet if there's someone who is able to straighten it, the afflicted person will not consider the road from the state of Qing to the state of Tu too far to go, because his finger is not like other people's. When one's finger is unlike the fingers of others, one knows enough to resent it. But when one's mind is not like the minds of others, one does not know enough to resent it. And this is what is called an ignorance of priorities. Now, the fourth finger is traditionally considered to be without a particular purpose or function. In Chinese, it's called the nameless finger. In medical terms, it's called the trigger finger. In this passage, Mencius describes the finger as being bent, but the condition isn't painful and it doesn't pose difficulties for the person going about their daily life. And yet, they would be concerned enough to travel a long way away from the state of Qing to Chu, and I've included a map on the next slide, to try and treat that finger, have it corrected. Now, you get the idea that they might feel a bit ashamed about this physical condition. The slide here shows the state of Qing over here and the state of Chu over here. And in Mencius's times, well, we didn't have many of the conveniences of transport like we have today. So it was a long, particularly long way. So Mencius points out that people can feel ashamed if their fingers are not like those of others, and they will go to great lengths to try and correct this physical condition. But on the other hand, if a person's mind is not as good as others, well, they might not know or do anything about it. And if you think about it, our mind is actually responsible for our every thought and action, our every interpersonal interaction. And it's probably the closest thing that we can correct. We don't need to travel for a long distance to see a particular specialist. And in many respects, the mind is the most important thing to correct. And some people just will fail to do so. So clearly, Mencius is telling us that they don't have their priorities in the right order. And he's here reminding us to try to prioritize what really matters. So these different passages gives us the taste of the insightful content that can help us understand our lives and better relate to others. Ultimately, learning goes hand in hand with applying what we've learned in daily life. Now, as the 11th century philosopher Chen Hong Mo once lamented, nowadays people will no longer know how to read. When they read the Analects, for instance, there's the same kind of person before they read the book and after they read the book. This is no different from not having read the book. So the idea is that, when we learn, study with a view to application, it really brings the books to life. It makes it relevant and worthwhile. And ancient philosophy in the Greco-Roman tradition also saw philosophy as a way of life. Indeed, the French philosopher Pierre Hadot once said that such is the lesson of ancient philosophy, an invitation to each human being to transform themselves. Philosophy is a conversion, a transformation of one's way of being and living, and a quest for wisdom. And on that note, I conclude our introduction to the 4 books. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelly and Catherine. Now we have a better idea of what forms the basis of Chinese cultural values and how to go about learning the 4 books. One cannot go deep into the learning of Chinese classics without knowledge of Chinese philology. This brings us to the next talk by the academic director of the Academy of Sinology and world-renowned scholar of Chinese phonology and historical linguistics, Professor Chia-Ning Chu, and together with Ms. Shu Shi Xu, who is currently a PhD student, to introduce to us the subject of Chinese philology. Professor Chu and Shu Shi, please.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, in this lecture, I will introduce to you what is the Chinese philology and how we learn it efficiently. Chinese philology mainly includes graphic study, phonology, lexicology, grammar, and also the application of the related knowledge in reading ancient classics. As such, we can understand the ancient classics more effectively. Reading ancient classics requires not only the ability to look up dictionaries and read ancient annotations, which only tell what it is. In addition, we should further know why it is, Only in this way can we have the ability to further study traditional Chinese culture. We hope that the study of Chinese philology helps students to cultivate their interest in the Chinese language and the characters, and discover the fun of learning them. For this, we will introduce many interesting stories about the study of the ancient Chinese language. Firstly, we will talk about the invention of Chinese writing system. We will introduce the origin and history of the development of Chinese characters, as well as the rules of character construction. Next, we will talk about the ancient Chinese phonology and the meaning of Chinese characters in ancient classics. We will also introduce ancient grammar, syntax, and lexicology. The next part, I will introduce to you the Chinese writing system. It is very unique in the writing system of the humankind. Chinese characters have experienced thousands of years of development and evolution, starting from the simple scripts on oracle bones to Jingwen, bronze script, the Zhou dynasty, and evolved to Zhuanshu, seal script. About 5,000 years ago, there was a sage called Changjie. According to ancient records, Changjie looked up to the sky and observed the stars and their patterns. He looked down at the topography of the ground and saw the traces of the feet of birds and beasts, and realized that their diverse patterns could be distinguished. He looked at his own body and other things in nature. He grasped the features and extracted the essential meaning from the signs of nature. And then the initial form of writing was created. We have the first Chinese character dictionary compiled in 100 CE. It is a dictionary that collects about 9,000 characters, which are categorized under 540 radicals. Now, we will invite Ms. Xu Shusi to introduce some knowledge you will learn about the Chinese characters. Shusi, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhu, for the general introduction. Now let me introduce the knowledge we will learn about Chinese characters. For the study of Chinese characters, we will introduce the origin and evolution of Chinese characters, and also the principles of character construction. How are Chinese characters constructed? Are there any underlying rationales behind the construction? What do the components of a character contribute to its meaning? Some friends might find it difficult to learn Chinese characters as they have too many strokes to remember. In fact, Chinese characters are not as difficult as we think. After mastering the principles of character formation, we are able to get their meanings easily. As we open the door to Chinese writing, we will find a wonderful world. Chinese characters were derived from our day-to-day experiences. When we look up to the heavens or look down to the earth with careful observation, we will find that Chinese characters can be seen everywhere in nature and in our daily life. According to ancient records, Cangjie was a scribe for the Yellow Emperor who lived around 5,000 years ago. Observing the footprints of birds and animals, he realized that the patterns and forms were distinguishable and started to formulate characters. The forms of characters were derived from objects commonly seen and accessible to the user. Imagine in the snowy winter, animals leave their own distinct footprints on the snow, like the tracks of a tiger, a deer, or birds. The paw print of a puppy looks like a plum blossom, whereas the footprint of a small bird resembles a bamboo stalk. Now let's have a look at a character, 变. Does it look like the footprint of an animal? The character depicts the claws of an animal and signifies to separate or to distinguish. This explains how characters began to take shape based on the tracks of birds and animals. The basic characters were developed from daily life phenomena. The ancient forms of Chinese characters include the oracle bone script, bronze script, and small seal script. Oracle bone scripts are inscriptions on turtle shells and animal bones from the Shang dynasty, which remain the earliest evidence of systematic characters to date. Next, there were inscriptions on bronze bells and vessels, which were mainly used in the Zhou dynasty. The small seal script was subsequently developed in the Qin dynasty and marks the divide between ancient and modern forms. An important book to be introduced is 说文解字, which has just been mentioned by Kelly and Catherine. 说文解字 is the earliest comprehensive Chinese character dictionary compiled around 100 CE. It was authored by Xu Shen, a great Confucius scholar from the Eastern Han Dynasty. 说文 provides a comprehensive analysis of the ancient forms, sounds, and meanings of Chinese characters based on the 6 principles of character construction, 六书. It collects 9,353 characters, which are categorized under 440 radicals. Xu Shen used quotations from the ancient classics to explain the characters. Thus, 说文 is considered to be the representation of the wisdom of ancient sages and the treasure of traditional Chinese culture. The title 说文解字 literally means explaining 文, which has simple characters, and analyzing 字, which are compound characters. Next, let me interpret the concept of 文字, character. In ancient times, the 2 characters that form the term 文字 had distinct meanings. The character 文 resembles intersecting brush strokes. Doesn't the ancient script look like the patterns produced through crisscross lines? 文 refers to simple characters which are indivisible. Combining simple characters 文 creates compound characters 字. The character 字 is made of 2 simple characters. Its top part is 年, which resembles the outline of a house. Its bottom part is 子, which resembles a child. When combined, 字 depicts a child under a roof. When the child grows up, he also has his own children and then grandchildren, thus propagating generation after generation. Thereby, 字 originally means to propagate. One of the unique features of Chinese characters is that they are ideographic, unlike alphabetic languages, which are phonological. Alphabetic languages vary with the change of dialects. Due to geographical separation, differences in the spoken language developed. Although there are differences in Chinese dialects, when they are written on paper, you will find no regional differences. The written words won't vary with the change of dialects. Therefore, there is no obstacle to communication. That's because Chinese characters are visual symbols which mark their meaning with form. Alphabetical languages are symbols of phonemes, which mark their pronunciation with letters. Languages change with time, and alphabetical languages change as their spoken form changes. For example, Old English in the age of Beowulf is much different from present-day English and cannot be understood by modern English speakers, as the pronunciations and the spellings have changed a lot. However, the written forms of Chinese characters generally remain the same, be it in the Tang Dynasty or the Song Dynasty or modern times. Today, we can still appreciate the beauty of a Tang poetry. Chinese characters have enabled long-established Chinese cultural traditions of thousands of years to be handed down to the present day. Chinese characters facilitate the continuous spiritual connection with the ancients and enable the cultural treasures and wisdom to be transmitted from generation to generation. They serve as a crucial medium to reach back into the past and enable us to learn from the wisdom embedded in ancient classics. The prerequisites for a foundational study of Chinese culture start with the study of its characters. The ancient Chinese invented characters in a very scientific way with much wisdom. With a willingness to learn and a proper method of study, anyone can master them. This is the brief introduction of Chinese characters. Thanks for listening. Next, let's welcome Professor Zhu to continue to introduce the study of ancient Chinese phonology and tell us some interesting stories about phonetic evolution of the Chinese language. Now let's welcome Professor Zhu. Thank you.
Thank you, Susi. Now, in this part, I will talk about a very important aspect of the Chinese language, phonology. I will focus on the field of its historical evolution. Historical Chinese phonology deals with the reconstruction of sounds of ancient Chinese. As Chinese is written in logographic characters, not alphabetic letters or syllabary, the methods employed in historical Chinese phonology differ considerably from those employed in, for example, Indo-European languages. The phonetic reconstruction of ancient Chinese sounds is a little bit complicated because, unlike Indo-European languages, no phonetic spellings are used. However, you will find a lot of fun in the process of research and learning. Chinese has been documented over a long period of time, with the earliest Auric Bones writings dating back to 1250 BCE. Ancient Chinese is written mostly in logographic characters, which do not directly specify the phonology of the language. Thus, The reconstruction depends to a large extent on ancillary sources that more directly record the phonology of language. Based on these sources, historical Chinese is generally divided into the following periods. The first one is Old Chinese. The Old Chinese period is from approximately 1250 BCE to 25 CE. The reconstruction of Old Chinese is based on the phonetic components of Chinese characters and the rhymes of early poetry, such as Shi Jing, the book of poetry, which is assumed to present the language of 1000 to 700 BCE. The next one is Middle Chinese. The Middle Chinese period is from around the 5th century CE to the 12th century, including the Northern and Southern dynasty, Sui, Tang, and Song dynasty. The reconstruction of Middle Chinese is usually based on the concrete phonetic material, which is the rhyme dictionary, 切韵, later expanded into the more complete 广韵, a rhyme book. 切韵 describes a compromise between the northern and southern varieties. The rhyme dictionaries are essential to read and write rhyming poetry. And the last one is modern varieties. Modern varieties refer to the phonology from around the 13th century CE to the present times. Most modern varieties appear to have split off from Middle Chinese around 1000 CE. The cross-cultural interaction in different languages has promoted each nation's linguistic concepts and research method. During the long process of history, the Chinese language is not exceptional. It has been influenced by other cultures, and yet continued to play an important role in the cross-cultural exchange between civilizations in world history. We will discuss Chinese phonology in 3 ways. First, the influence of ancient Sino-Indian on historical Chinese phonology, the translation of Buddhist scripture, and the cross-cultural exchange between China and India have benefited the analytical skills in Chinese phonology. Phonology has become a fundamental study in reading ancient Chinese classics and inheritance of ancient culture. Next, we will explore and compare the linguistics studies by Chinese and Western scholars since the 17th century, and how Chinese phonology was inspired by Western languages after the 19th century. Chinese scholars have absorbed new linguistic concepts and methods. They have gained more understanding of the commonality of languages, which contributed to the study and the reconstruction of the consonants in archaic Chinese. Lastly, we will talk about the application of phonological knowledge in teaching Chinese as a foreign language. It introduces how to apply the basic rules of Chinese phonology in teaching Chinese as a second language. Through the understanding and application of Chinese phonology, we were able to trace the origin of words and understand why this is so expressed. The application of Chinese phonology in Chinese language teaching is a useful and valuable technique. Next, let's talk about some interesting stories about the ancient Chinese phonology. The first story is Chinese appellation of father, the formation of Baba. Have you heard that Confucius did not know the character Ba, father? Then, how did Confucius call Papa? Nowadays, Chinese kids call their father Ba, but you can't find the character in the book 说文解字, an ancient dictionary written by the Han scholar Xu Sheng. The Chinese character Ba appeared after the 3rd century CE. Then, how did the Chinese people call their fathers in Confucius' time? Now, let's see the reason why there was no written form of the word Ba in Confucius' times, and how the kids called their father during the period. Let's have a look at some rules of the evolution of Chinese phonology. In ancient Chinese, the character Fu was used for father. Why father was called Fu instead of Ba? Why father was not called as Papa in ancient Chinese, just like other civilizations in the world today? The answers can be revealed in the history of phonology. Qian Daxing, a Chinese scholar of the Qin dynasty, had a great discovery in the evolution of pronunciation over a long period of time. He believed that the current consonant F was pronounced as P in ancient times. With the application of his theory, the initial consonant of the character Fu was originated from the Old Chinese P. Another rule in the evolution of Chinese phonology is that today's vowel U is originally pronounced as A. The character Fu in Old Chinese should be pronounced as Ba when these two rules are applied in the pronunciation of Fu. Therefore, we can understand that in ancient China, children also called their father Papa, just as in all the other languages in the world. After the 3rd century, a new character, Ba, was created with a phonetic symbol, Ba, added below the character Fu. Since the pronunciation of the character Fu changed from Ba to Fu, it is no longer suitable for recording the appellation of father Ba. Therefore, although Confucius did not know the character Ba, he still called his father Baba, which was written as Fu in Confucius' time. Furthermore, I will introduce to you the story and the evolution of the word cha, tea. Do you think that Confucius also drank tea just like us for centuries? Tea has been the most popular drink for every Chinese household. People believe that tea is beneficial for health. Tea is considered one of the necessities in their daily life. Let's have a look at the evolution of the Chinese character for tea. What kind of tea did Confucius drink? It was tu. There are two cognate words for tea in Chinese, cha and tu. Dating back to over 1,000 years ago, Chinese ancestors found a kind of herbal plant which tastes bitter and cool. They called it tu. They fermented the leaves of tu and made a mellow and relaxing drink. They continued improving their skills in fermentation and finally produced a new kind of drink, cha. Later, many kinds of fine tea were produced. They wrote the fine tea as cha, which is slightly different from tu. Later, tea ceremony, cha dao, and the tea culture developed in the Tang Dynasty. The tea culture gradually spread from China to the whole world. Up to the present time, the words for tea in all languages originated from Chinese. In Korean, the tea in the word tea house, da bang, is pronounced as da. Tea is pronounced as de in both the Ming dialect of China, spoken in Fujian and Taiwan, and French, te. In English, cha is pronounced as tea. It is a foreign word which evolved from the cognate words cha and tu in ancient Chinese. Through this example, we can see that the low vowel r gradually shift into the high vowel e. This sound shift in Chinese coincides with the change of the vowels in English. We call it the great vowel shift. This change is considered as a universal rule in linguistics. How did the pronunciation of cha change from da to de and eventually to ti? Firstly, the words tu and cha in Mandarin originated from the same pronunciation da. Secondly, the modern Chinese, the word cha keeps the original final a. The word tu retains the original initial t. This represents their cognate relationship. Teaching the Chinese language could be easy and effective if we combine the knowledge of Chinese phonology and the rules of phonetic change with the written and spoken Chinese in modern times. Once the distinctive characteristics of Chinese words and their pronunciation are identified through the study of Chinese phonology, the same rules is applicable to other words in Chinese. This knowledge would make Chinese teaching more efficient. Furthermore, we will introduce the change of meanings of Chinese characters and introduce some characteristics of Chinese grammar and the formation of Chinese words. How have they evolved over thousands of years? Besides, we will make a clear understanding about the differences between Chinese grammar and Western grammar. In addition, we will also explain how Chinese words are constructed. What are the rules? We hope this knowledge can also be applied to better understanding of ancient classics. The above is an overview of Chinese philology. I hope you will enjoy it. This is the end of my presentation. Thanks for listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Chu and Shu Shi. We can see that with the right method, learning the Chinese language can be fun and is not as daunting as it seems. For the next part of the program, Kelly will present to us the essentials of bringing about order from assembled texts, a set of texts that was pivotal in establishing the prosperity of the Tang dynasty. Kelly, please.
Thank you very much, Xinghui. Okay. Well, firstly, I'm very grateful to the Academy of Sinology and the University of Wales Trinity St. David for giving me this opportunity to talk a bit about the subjects planned for the Academy's English Bachelor's Program. And the subject is based on a text called The Essentials for Bringing About Order from Assembled Texts. Okay. This book on the right here is a relatively recent edition published by the National Library of China in Beijing. And this book actually comes to us from a period of the 7th century in China known as the Jinghuan era. And that was the reign of Emperor Taizong, who is depicted here on the left. Now, what I'm going to do, I think some of you may already know about this book. It's otherwise known as the Governing Principles of Ancient China, and say that some of you may know or have heard about this through this series of books called Governing Principles of Ancient China 360. The series has come about because in recent decades, parts of the essentials for bringing about order from assembled texts, which I'll call essentials for short, it's a long name, parts of the essentials has been translated into various languages. And we have here, for example, Arabic, vernacular Chinese in both traditional and simplified forms, English, French, there's German, Japanese, Russian, Spanish, and Vietnamese. So what I thought I might do, instead of focusing on the content of the essentials, I'm going to talk a little bit about the text, the historical background of the text, introducing the text and its historical background so we can have some idea of, how it came to be compiled and, what's so special or significant about this compilation. So as the name suggests, Essentials for Bringing About Order from Assembled Texts, it's an anthology, and it's an imperially commissioned anthology by Emperor Taizong himself. It contains extracts from pre-existing literature that span 3 out of the 4 traditional bibliographical classifications of Chinese literature, and that would be the canonical or classics, canonical writings, the histories, historical writings, and the masters, or also called the philosophical writings. And there are actually 68 sources altogether. And then some would say that it would belong to the literary tradition called the Mirror's Four Princes. And this is an ancient tradition of literature designed for the moral and political education of state leaders. And this is because the Essentials was designed to help the young Emperor Taizong to develop the ethical character and the cultural literacy, as well as get up to speed on the formal learning that traditionally considered essential for governing the empire. Now, the historical record shows that, well, after the end of the Sui dynasty in the year 618, and the Sui dynasty sort of preceded the Tang dynasty, Taizong was then known as Li Shiming. He was then just a prince. He helped his father to settle rival claims to sovereignty and subdue rebellion against the newly founded Tang dynasty. And when Li Shiming succeeded his father to become the second emperor of Tang China, he was only 28 years old. And it had been less than a decade since the fall of the Sui dynasty. And, reunification of the empire under the Tang rulership had only been finalized about 2 years earlier. So it was still very much a fledgling Tang dynasty. Now, Emperor Taizong, he was conscious that his career as a military commander and a strategist had left little opportunity for the formal scholarship and learning required for statecraft and government. And but not only do we know from the historical record that Taizong overcame the odds, that he came to be recognized for consolidating the fledgling Tang dynasty. So sort of Taizong the consolidator. That's not my words, that's the words of the historian Howard Wetzler. Now, the Tang dynasty was a dynasty that went on to last for almost 300 years. We have the dates here. And Emperor Taizong himself ruled for over 20 years. Now, later courts in China, as well as overseas, found his leadership to be exemplary. And the name of his reign period, entitled Jingguan, became synonymous with good government. So his practice of government came to be known as the good government of Jingguan. Now, as you may know, the Tang dynasty is celebrated as a golden period of cultural flourishing and economic prosperity. And it's been regarded as the second great age of Chinese empire, widely regarded to have surpassed the first age, the first great age, the Han dynasty. Now, Tang China is known for many things, from poetry to porcelain and technological innovations. Perhaps most importantly, it's been credited with the Tang tradition. Now, what's the Tang tradition? Well, the British historian Charles Fitzgerald writes about the Tang tradition in his biography of Emperor Taizong, so the biography of Li Shiming. And he writes that before Taizong's time, before his reign, unity in China had been the exception, the achievement of a few strong dynasties. Feudalism and partition had been the rule. But from the 7th century onwards, China has far more often and for far longer been united rather than divided. Partitions have been the consequence of partial foreign conquest or a temporary interlude between strong dynasties. Always, the Tang tradition reasserted itself. So what is it? Well, that tradition of unified empire, administered by a civil service, taking its orders from one supreme central authority, was the life's work of Li Shiming, was the legacy of Emperor Taizong, and it has maintained and spread in the Far East the Chinese culture, one of the great civilizing forces in the world's history. So notice that the establishment of the Tang tradition, this enduring tradition of a unified empire administered by a civil central authority, is actually accredited or attributed to Emperor Taizong. Taizong out of all of the emperors of Tang China. And I think that when we look at the essentials, for bringing about order for simple texts, as being a text that was put together for Emperor Taizong near the start of his reign, this text presents a unique window into the classical scholarship and the political discourse underpinning one of the most successful rulerships in China's history. So, in fact, the Tang historian David McMullen has described essentials as follows: the 7th century equivalent of a sizable encyclopedia of political wisdom intended to save the emperor reading time. It offered an efficient route to minimum learning, and that was what Taizong needed. The British sinologist Dennis Twitchett has also described the essentials as being very frequently referred to in Japan as an authoritative source on politics and the sovereign's role. I'll talk a little bit more about the significance of the essentials a bit later. So, get the idea that the essentials was really, it's called the essentials. What Taizong he's having to learn on the job as the emperor, probably fairly busy, a lot of things to do, not a lot of time to study, only interested in what he really needed to know. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about now is explore why was it commissioned? Who was involved? What happened? Was it actually used? Was it approved by Emperor Taizong? And as I mentioned before, to what extent was it meaningful? Was it significant for later courts after his rule? Now, if we look at the preface to the text, and it's a preface by Wei Zheng, who's the chief editor for the compilation, we get an idea of, the literary challenge confronting Taizong in the early days of his reign, and the reasons giving rise to this imperial commission's terms of reference. Wei Zheng writes that Your Majesty finds the writings of the classics bewildering, and masters, the philosophical writings disparate. Analysing exhaustively the principles, natures is fatiguing yet futile. Reading extensively without perspective broadens knowledge without much grasp of the essentials. We have therefore been ordered to select from diverse texts, excise the irregular, irrelevant, and illuminate the exemplary standards. So, that Taizong is described as finding the extensive literature bewildering and disparate. You really get the sense that it was difficult for him to know where to start, how to read effectively. And he sort of needed his advisors, his officials, to try and provide that clarity and order. And they certainly did so by selecting not only the relevant texts that he needed to read, but the most important parts, the most essential parts to provide governance. So to provide him with the guidance for governing, including the model standards and practices. Now, you might be wondering, well, why didn't he just consult one of the books in the palace library? Why did he have to compile a new one? Go to the trouble of putting a new one together. If we look at the palace library collection, these figures are based on the monograph on literature in the Sui dynasty, and that was compiled by Wei Zheng, actually, during the Jingguan reign. And it gives us an idea of the size of the palace library collection. It was about over 14,000 texts, consisting of almost 90,000 scrolls. That's a fair bit to read. Well, you might be wondering, well, what about just the texts on government then, on statecraft? You don't need to read every single book in the palace library. Well, here I've listed two compilations, and they're actually identified in the preface by Wei Zheng. And one was put together in the 3rd century, the other in the 6th century, and they come to, they're both over 600 scrolls. And that's fairly voluminous. And incidentally, They're compilations, as I mentioned, and they include their extracts in order of topics or subject. And we'll go into this a little bit more. Now, as the emperor mentioned before, having to learn on the job, you're pretty time poor. So he was Taizong only interested in what he really needed to know. Well, if we look back at the preface, Wei explains that the essentials actually is very compact. It draws from the classics to the various masters, spanning, the earliest times of Chinese history through to the Jing dynasty, and it comprises 50 scrolls altogether. Compared to over 600, this is, compact. This is great. And it primarily seeks to capture the gist of governance. And that's why it's entitled The Essentials of Bringing About Order, at least in English. So get the idea that it's compact. Here, there's a bit of a translation of the contents pages. Scroll 1 has the preface, and 1 to 10 includes all the classics, extracts from the classics, followed by extracts from the historical writings from 11 to 30, and then from 31 onwards all the way to scroll 50, you have the master's works, the philosophical writings. And notice that the extracts are categorized by their source, so probably made it easier. Taizong wouldn't feel mixed up, where, having to remember which quote comes from which book. Having these sort of probably made it a more handy reference, basically. Now, being a more reference, it was also more concise reference. This is also from the preface, and Wei Zheng sort of distinguishes the essentials from other writings from recent and ancient times by emperors and princes, where they compete in the use of ornate language and the dissemination of preposterous notions to flaunt their conversancy with trivial scholarship, embellish their limited skill. So, the essentials is serious. It's about, statecraft, and they pay particular attention to keeping the language clear and concise. And in a later paragraph, unlike other reference books, the Essentials compiles the essential readings from diverse texts under a new title to facilitate a complete understanding without extraneous information. Each extract is materially complete, so it's aims to be comprehensive, and each matter is related in form. So, going backwards. Now, I talked about the Imperial Conspectus and the other comprehensive digest following convention in grouping by subject. And this is also from Wei Zheng's preface. And he sort of points out that, well, there are some certain downsides to that approach. Terms and entries reiterate each other, the introductions and conclusions are disorganized, the text and its meaning are disrupted, and the usage and study of them is difficult. So we can understand that there would be repetition or overlap. We have in the scope of the topics or subjects, and sometimes duplication, where one passage could be relevant across multiple topics. So Wei Zheng identifies the faults of existing compilations. And at the bottom here, I've included a passage from the first book chapter in English about the essentials, and it's by Fan Wang. And she observes that she compares the editorial approach between the Imperial Conspectus and the essentials. And she makes the point that while the compilers of the Imperial Conspectus, the Huanglan, dismembered the original texts, drawing attention to themselves as the organizing intelligence that weaved heterogeneous textual fragments into a coherent moralistic narrative. Well, the essentials foregrounded the coherence of the original works. Its legitimacy derived from the authority of the classics per se. From I think that she would also mean the sources per se. Didn't really mix them up, kept them in the order and through its arrangement by source. So why was it commissioned? It's commissioned to provide a concise, comprehensive statecraft for Emperor Taizong. Now, who was involved? There were 4 editors. We've mentioned Wei Zheng already. And he was, I suppose, by virtue of his role as the director of the Palace Library at the time, he was the chief editor. And more than that, prior to being the director of the Palace Library, under the reign of Taizong's father, he had served as assistant in the Palace Library department. So you could say that he was probably familiar with all that the Imperial Library had to offer for this project. And Taizong obviously entrusted him with the, probably preferred his approach to learning from the historical past by entrusting him with overseeing the writing of no less than 5 of the official histories for the preceding dynasties here. Now, interestingly, it's notable that during the early days of the Jingguan reign, the court was divided as to the administrative direction that the rulership should take. And it was actually Wei Zheng who recommended Taizong to implement a Confucian model of government, a government that was centered on education of ethical character and leadership by virtuous example. So perhaps it's probably no surprise that Wei Zheng plays a key role in being the chief editor of the Essentials, being supposed to educate a book, supposed to educate Taizong on how to govern. Now, this is a passage from the Essentials of Government from the Jingguan era, and this passage is attributed to Taizong, where he explains that, at the start of the reign, people all disagreed, saying that at the time it was certainly not possible to practice the imperial way, Huang Dao, the way of a true king. It was only Wei Zheng who urged me on. And this is the reference to the Confucian model of ideal government. And, after following his counsel within just a few years, we've achieved peace in the civilized world. And what has enabled us to reach this point is all due to the efforts of Wei Zheng. So you can really get an idea of the high regard Taizong has for his chief editor. Now, after Wei Zheng, is next listed, and he was part of the academic elite. He was also serving as the vice director of the Palace Library at the time. He was entrusted with educating the Crown Prince, as we can see depicted here, and also entrusted with the drafting of texts, like the history of the Liang dynasty that took place during the reign of Taizong's father, and the records of extended territory, which was a comprehensive gazetteer of the empire. This was under Taizong's rule. Now, Xiao Deyan was so highly esteemed by Emperor Taizong that he was compared to these historic Confucian exemplars. Now, I'll probably recognize the first 4 names as being prominent scholars, prominent students of Confucius. Now, Yan Hui and Min Ziqian is recognized. They were recognized in the analects for being distinguished in virtue. Zi You and Zi Xia were distinguished in, recognized for their distinctions in erudition. Xiao Deyan is mentioned in the same breath by Taizong as these Confucian exemplars. Now, Fu Sheng, some of you may know that he's credited with saving the classic of documents, one of the 5 classics. And as the legend goes, he was an erudite during the Qing dynasty. And what he did was he risked his life, basically, to conceal a copy of the classic, the documents, in the wall of his house when the Qing dynasty, Qing government was those sorts of books were being burned and banned by the Qing government. And after the end of the Qing government, the Han government tried to recover lost texts. And Fu Sheng, who was already in his 90s at the time, he was able to recover the the text, retrieved the text from the wall of his house. And, well, some say that instead of retrieving the book from the wall of his house, he actually recited the whole text from memory. And not only that, but he provided instruction on the text itself. And it's actually Fu Sheng's version of that classic, the documents that we read today. And last but not least, Yang Zhen. He lived during the 1st century, during the Eastern Han Dynasty, and he was immensely learned in the classics. Before he became a government official, he devoted his efforts to the cause of education, so, insisting on universal access to education. And he taught so many students that he became known as Confucius, the Confucius west of the passes. And that's Yang Zhen. So Xiao Deyan is esteemed by Taizong, mentioned in the same breath as these legendary Confucian exemplars. Now, then there is Yu Shennan, so the academic elite. He put together this concise discourse on emperors and kings for Emperor Taizong, helping him to learn from the historical experiences of past rulers. He actually succeeded Wei Zheng as the director of the Palace Library from the year 633. And there's an anecdote where Taizong actually describes Yu Shennan as a walking library. As the story goes, one time, Taizong was about to embark on an inspection tour. His attendants asked if he needed his books to be brought along as they were preparing the imperial carriage. Taizong replies, "Oh, that's not necessary. Yu Shennan will be with me, and he is a walking library. I've heard of walking encyclopedias before, but Yu Shennan is a complete library, mobile. Obviously saves Taizong reading the books himself." Now, you can get an idea. Well, before I go into that, Taizong actually praises Yu Shennan for his distinctions in 5 areas: for moral virtue, scholarship, dedication, writings, and calligraphy. And we sort of get an idea of the close working relationship between Taizong and Wei Zheng and Yu Shennan, where from this passage attributed to Taizong, where he remarks that in recent years, when we have held court to oversee affairs or taking our leisure and enjoyment within the parks and orchards, we've always summoned Wei Zheng and Yu Shennan to attend and accompany us. Sometimes we have planned and discussed the business of governance together, or discoursed on scriptures, the classics and canonical texts. The enlightening things we've often heard have not only brought benefit to himself, but one could say that this was the way to lasting peace of the dynasty's state altars. So, you get an idea of they worked closely together and his extremely high regard for his editors. And last but not least, we have Chu Liang. Now, Chu Liang was also a member of the academic elite. I'll just have a look. He served Emperor Taizong as a senior recorder, as well as a military strategist, often accompanying him on military expeditions. So basically, all 4 editors, they occupied, senior roles within the Jingguan administration. They were highly trusted. They had the trust and confidence of their ruler. They were equipped with expertise in the cultural knowledge necessary. They were very familiar with Taizong's needs, his preferences for learning from the past, and his political vision going forward. So that's really what they brought to the project that eventually became the essentials for bringing about order from assembled texts. Now, what happened after that? After all the work that was put in, it was completed in the year 631, and it was warmly approved by Emperor Taizong. How do we know? Have a look. In the same month that the Essentials was presented to the throne, Emperor Taizong actually personally wrote this reply to Wei Zheng as the chief editor. And he writes, reading what has been recorded, we are impressed by its comprehensiveness and conciseness. We've discovered matters that were hitherto unknown and unheard of. It enables us to bring about order by studying antiquity and oversee matters without any doubt. Isn't such accomplishments great indeed? Wei Zheng and the others are to be given 1,000 bolts of plain silk and 500 lengths of coloured silk. The Crown Prince and other princes are each to be given a copy of the Essentials. So Taizong certainly appreciated that the Essentials provided comprehensive coverage, it was concisely expressed, found it to be helpful for understanding the past and overseeing matters with confidence. Not only did he generously reward the editors for their efforts, but he must have found it useful enough to order copies for each of the princes. Now, besides this initial response, there's evidence that the text went on to become a book that he consulted regularly. In a memorial to Emperor Xianzong during the early 9th century of the Tang Dynasty, the scholar official Li Jiang wrote that in the past, Taizong also instructed Wei Zheng and others to comprehensively select the deeds from each era and compile the essentials for bringing about order in diverse books. Then Taizong kept the text at the side of his seat, and he would constantly study and reflect on it. And this is an official serving in the courts of one of the later Tang emperors. And he's commenting on the fact that, well, Essentials was regularly studied by Taizong. So it seems that the book was with Taizong's approval, and he read it off. So I removed the question mark. Now, as for the extent to which it was significant for later courts in China and Japan, well, we know from historical records that beyond the Jingguan reign period, beyond Taizong's government, the Essentials was known to and or read by some emperors of the later Tang dynasty, as well as during the 19th century of the Qing dynasty, the final sort of period of imperial government in China. In between, there were several centuries where the text was actually lost. But interestingly, the Essentials has enjoyed relatively uninterrupted transmission in Japan, where it's been studied by generations of the ruling elite, from the heavenly emperors to the shogunates, over some 800 years since the 8th century. So such historical evidence sort of supports the idea that the Essentials served as a source book for theoretical discourse underpinning Emperor Taizong's practice of government. And it sort of goes some way to helping us understand how and why his rulership became exemplary and exportable. And it offers insight, obviously, into the learning within the tradition of mirrors for princes. This text designed for the political and moral education of state rulers. Now, I'll end with this particular image, and it's an image from the website of the Tokyo National Museum. And this is actually the oldest extant edition of the Essentials. It was discovered after World War II, and it's acquired the status of national treasure in Japan. Sadly, only 13 of the original 50 scrolls have survived, and 7 of those 13 scrolls are now accessible online through the e-museum of the National Tokyo Museum. So I think that gives us a bit of an introduction to the Essentials for bringing that order from assembled texts, a bit more understanding of how this compilation came to be compiled, and just an inkling of how it became significant during its time and for later courts, both in China and Japan. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Kelly. The Essentials is indeed an important book that can inform us on the principles and ways of governance. Last but not least, we will invite Dr. Xicheng Liu, Program Director of the Postgraduate Specialist Finance Programs at Swansea University, to share on the topic, Economic Principles and Traditional Chinese Philosophy. Dr. Liu, please.
Okay, good morning. Right. So I'm going to give a quick introduction about the course Economics in Traditional Chinese Philosophy. I don't have any slides. I'm just going to talk through it, and I'll keep it brief. Is my audio working all right? Is it okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you. So this is a new lecture series, and in this particular lecture series, we'll explore the theories of economic management in traditional Chinese culture. Now, some of you may say that economics is a modern concept, and that's right. The discipline was first formally defined by the Scottish philosopher Adam Smith in 1776 as an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Right? He wrote a book called Wealth of Nation, and the subject itself, economics, was first called political economy in the late 19th century, and the British economist Alfred Marshall changed the name to economics, okay, as a shorter term for economic science. Now, during the last 300 years, economics has evolved into many different branches, as you know, for example, microeconomics, macroeconomics, international economics, and so on, and later on, behavioral economics. Okay, but anyway, economics is essentially a social science that studies the production, distribution, consumption of goods and services, and it looks at the behavior and interaction of economic agents and how the economy works, basically. So the subject, like I said, it has only been in existence for 300 years. So it's a relatively young social science. However, human society and human interaction existed long before the word economics was ever invented, right? Now, if you think about the long history of the Chinese history as a civilization, and as you all are well aware, there are records dated back to over 5,000 years ago, and during this time, countries and societies arose and disappeared, and as Kelly said earlier, right, the good conducts and excellent governance were recorded and studied by the scholars and practiced by generations of kings and families and clans. But also the bad conducts were also recorded and studied by the scholars. So in traditional Chinese culture, economics is not an alien subject, but quite an ancient subject, if you like. And all of these economic theories have been extracted from thousands of years of practice and experiment, not on a computer, of course, but with real people. And as you will see in this course, whenever it happens in the future, the classics and texts not only provide us with theoretical deductions, but also stories and explanations. So in modern, scientific terminology, we can say that these traditional texts have all the meat and bones of scientific research, such as, hypothesis development, data gathering, hypothesis testing, and so on. Okay. But the problem is, these days, economics is more about numbers, right? It's more about numbers. But the ancient Chinese recognize that economics is fundamentally a social science. I mean, you can say there was a mathematical element in there, but it's essentially a social science, which is about the people, right? Now, this is because the improvement of economic condition is ultimately based on the improvement of human nature through education. Now, I think this is really important, so let me just repeat this. It's because the improvement of economic condition is ultimately based on the improvement of human nature through education. So economics and things like, ethics are not entirely separate subjects. And as you know, in traditional teaching, topics such as economics, ethics, sociology, education are one entity. And they usually do appear in the same chapter or the same book, right? So I think the advantage of of this kind of knowledge system is that it prevents the downside of the modern partition system of teaching. If you open any, if you pick any economics or finance textbooks, right, any textbook, you may find a standalone chapter on things like the return, rate of return or GDP or things like that, right? And there's no mentioning about human development, just the numbers. And you might think, well, that's okay because this chapter is just about the numbers. However, the problem with that is that the overemphasis on such things, the rate of return or GDP, can result in the deterioration of the economic indicators in the long term. And I'll give you an example towards the end of this talk. So now to show you why economics teaching is embedded in traditional culture. Let's talk a bit about the Confucian analects. I mean, is the Catherine gave an introduction about it, and is the text that everybody knows. So we're not going to go through any quote, but let's say this book has 20 chapters, right? 20 chapters on the topics such as ethical conducts, rights and music, right? Managing state affairs, discussion of the past kings and their mistakes, personal conduct and appearance, and also views about the people that Confucius met during his traveling, and so on. Okay. Now, there is not a single word about economics in Confucian analects. So we might mistakenly think that, oh, Confucius doesn't he has never talked about economics. He doesn't know. However, Zhao Pu, the chancellor of the first chancellor who helped Emperor Taizu to establish the Song dynasty, right? He said that I helped the first emperor to win the world, if you like, with half of the analects. I don't know which half, right? But basically 50% of it. And I used the other half to help the second emperor, Emperor Taizong of Song, to govern the world. So the first 50% is to help to win the world and use the other half to manage it. Now, if you think about managing a country or managing the world, the governance of a country or the world is essentially the management of economic life. I mean, there are many other things, but if you look at the news these days, it's all about economics. It's all about, living standard and things like that. So a big chunk of it, a big chunk of governance is indeed the management of economic life. So we can never deny the power, right, of economic teaching that is embedded in these traditional texts. It has to be there. Now, as I said earlier, the writing style of traditional text is different from modern textbooks, right? So in order to help the modern learners and policymakers to make the most out of these valuable teachings, what I do is to extract relevant content from them and rearrange according to the general frame of modern economics teaching. Okay, so in other words, the teaching materials are not classic oriented, but content oriented. So this is the the plan for this lecture series in the future, and we will investigate traditional topics such as consumption, production, distribution, all right, to mirror the modern knowledge system. Now, another thing about this is the delivery of this course. The delivery is oriented by practice, what is driven by practice and use. Okay, and I think we should always keep in mind how we can incorporate the traditional teaching into modern policy making. I mean, if you think about it, Zhao Po, he successfully used the analects to assist the building or the founding of the Song Empire. I'm sure he used other classics, of course, but let's use build the argument based on his quote, right? He successfully used the analects to assist the founding of the Song dynasty, but it was already 1400 years after the analects was compiled, right? It wasn't written the day before. It was 1400 years ago from his time. Now, another 1,000 years passed since Zhao Po, but we modern humans still worry about the same economic problems as our ancestors did. Nothing has ever changed. So it is very valuable to my opinion. Okay. Now, before we move on to the fundamental theories of Confucius, I want to clarify which component of traditional Chinese philosophy that this particular course is related to. And as you all are aware, the traditional Chinese culture is a combination of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. So I want to make it crystal clear from the beginning that the three branches are never ever to be treated as entirely different religions, right? And I remember the Venerable Master Qin Gong has mentioned on numerous occasions that the three teachings are only different in the form, but the idea and the content are already fused together. All right. For example, the Taoist masters read the Buddhist sutras and the Confucian and Mencius classics, and the Confucians also read the Buddhist sutra and the Taoist classics. Okay, so they are they are from one single entity, but because of this time limit, right? I think if this course does, I mean, realistically, in the university, you have 5-6 weeks for each course. So because of the time limit, in terms of the classics and the text, I intentionally select most of the materials from Confucian classics, not because the other two are not important. Now, the reason is that we want to make direct reference to the ancient political and economic teaching. So it is suitable for our purpose to design our teaching material with some constraints. Okay, so this is the basic structure of this lecture series. Now, I'm going to take a bit of a time to talk about the fundamental concept and philosophy of Confucius, and try to see how they are related to economic development. Okay, so I'll try to keep it brief. Now, the way that we can, categorize Confucius' teaching is numerous, right? There are many dimensions through which we can do this, but what we can do is to divide the classics into two. I'm sorry, the concept into two. The two classes of concept. One is called the law of variety. Law of variety, and the other is called the law of unity. The law of unity. Okay, so the law of variety refers to things that are changeable with the need at different times, right? With the need at the time. But the law of unity refers to what doesn't change, what is independent of time, and that is human nature. Okay. Now, within the law of variety, we have what is called the three stages. The three stages. Whereas the nature of man, which is, what doesn't change, we have the principle of love and principle of reciprocity. Okay, I'll give more details in a minute. Now let's have a look at the three stages, right? The law of variety. Now, what are they? Well, the three stages simply refer to the general concept of social evolution. It is basically a rough classification of social status in a time series fashion. Okay, like I said, it changes through time. Now, in the Book of Rights, which is one of the 5 classics, it's actually one of the 6 classics, but the Book of Music has been lost. So, and it's also called, I guess, the Book of Rituals or Ceremony. But anyway, okay, in the Book of Rights, the chapter of the evolution of civilization, Confucius describes that the human society starts off from what is called the disorderly stage. And then it moves on to what is called the advancing peace stage. Okay, and there's another name for it, it's called the small tranquility. Before reaching the extreme peace stage, the final extreme peace stage. Okay, so just remember this disorderly stage, advancing peace stage in the middle, and then extreme peace stage. So 3 different stages. Now, we're not going to look at the text itself, but if you notice, if you care to look, if you notice that in this stage of advancing peace stage, which is the middle one, right? The middle one. Confucius mentions a number of different relations. They are the relations between rulers and subordinates. And in today's language, I guess, it also equivalent to the relationship between managers and employees, for example. Okay. Also, relationship between parents and children, between siblings, between husband and wife, and between friends as well. Okay, so 5 human relations. Also, Confucius mentions 5 moral constants in the passage, which are benevolence, righteousness, rights or ritual, rules of propriety, and wisdom and sincerity. Okay. Now, the question is, why are the above relations or moral constant only mentioned in the advancing peace stage, but not in the extreme peace stage? I mean, if you look at the text, all of these relations are only mentioned in the middle stage, which is the advancing peace stage or small tranquility, but not in the final stage, not in the extreme peace stage. Why is that? Well, I think the reason is that people only, in the extreme peace stage, which is the final stage, people only have love and are selfless. This is the highest level of human development. Not necessarily materially, but at least mentally. Okay. And people from all classes and groups, social groups, know about helping others and serving others. So this is the definition of extreme peace. Therefore, there is no need to mention anything about the correct human relation or morality, because people would have returned to their innate goodness and inner nature. But in the advancing peace state, the one in the middle, people think of themselves. I mean, they do think of others, but they also think of themselves. So there is a need to, remind people about the proper human relation and morality. There's a need for it. Now, I think this concept of, evolution of society has practical implications for policymaking. If you look at the history of economic and financial market development, we may find that policymaking is time variant as well. It changes through time. For example, in the opening of China in 1978, all right, the Chinese, it marked a new era of economic development. The government implemented a new economic system in 1978 or 79, around that time, turning from complete central planning to a mix of central intervention and a market-based economy. And the government's goal changed from what is called the class struggle to what is called the total economic development, as we know today, right? And well, the rationale is very simple. The country was poor at the time. And, and so there's this total shift in government objectives echoed the voice of the people. People need a better material life. So the basic necessities must be made sufficient to the people. And so the country must completely revamp its economic system. And so these changes were put in place by basically putting material needs as the priority. Okay, so since then, the government made countless reforms from agriculture, rights and property of farmers, the banking system, price setting mechanisms, and taxation system and whatnot. So for the first time, private enterprises were no longer under the administration of the state, and foreign companies were allowed to make direct investment in China, okay, from 1978 or 9. Now, after several decades of economic development, wealth has multiplied to a level that was unimaginable 40 years ago. But the struggle, okay, the struggle is not always there, just different forms. The struggle is no longer the fight to survive, but the need for mental richness. Okay, making money is always important. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's always important. It will always be important. But, well, at least for ordinary people, okay. But the government begins to focus more on the harmony development of the society and human relation by learning from the traditional culture. So this is simply an evolution of the society. And it is very closely related to the principle of the 3 stages by Confucius that we mentioned earlier, right? And also, the society doesn't necessarily progress in a linear fashion, right? So sometimes you go from disorderly stage to, advancing peace stage, and then to extreme peace stage. But then you may go back to chaos because of both external and internal factors. And I think we can all witness what is happening today, right? What is hidden behind this seemingly prosperous economic and technological advancement is the ever-growing inequality, divided society, financial market disruption with increasing destructive power and frequency. And on the top of those, we've got the loss of filial piety between children and family, diminishing, harmony between husband and wife, between siblings, friends. I think only a blind person would say there is no such a problem, right? But this is where the traditional Chinese philosophy can offer solutions. I think it's fair to say that all the Confucian teachings, I mentioned Confucius a lot because, like I said, this course focuses on Confucian classics because of the, physical constraint of the teaching time. So all the Confucian teachings aim to direct people towards their original inner goodness, right? I mean, if you examine the governance of the sage rulers in the history of mankind, you may find that in making economic policies, they all consider the consequential impact on human nature development. So it's not just the numbers, right? Not just the numbers. And in economics, there's actually a word for it. It's called externality. Externality. And that it refers to the cost and benefit that affects the party who didn't choose to incur that cost or benefit. So things like pollution or the systematic risk brought by the banking system's risk taking. They're just some of the examples, okay, of negative externality. But the true externality is much broader than these quantifiable factors. for example, a overemphasis on free competition leads to a focus on quantitative economic indicators. And this will lead to a diminishing importance of the qualitative indicators, such as morality. Well, at least there's very little mentioning of these moral factors in any of the mainstream economic or financial research. Okay, people don't talk about it. But people talk about morality in a separate module called, perhaps corporate governance or things like that. But then that is a separate subject. They are never mentioned together with the mainstream economic teaching. And I think that is wrong. So that's the social evolution. Now, but human nature doesn't change, right? So what we just said is the law of variety, the change of the society. But human nature, however, doesn't change, and that is the law of unity. Okay. The law of unity is basically based on the inner nature of man, and that nature is love, the principle of love. So what is it? What is love? Well, that's going to take a day to explain it, but let's look at what Venerable Master Chin Kung said about love, which I think is the most concise. He explained the concept of love in a lot of details. He said that when we look outwards, right, when we look at other people, we love others. But it's not, it's not love in a narrow sense. Loving your own kind or loving love between different genders. It's not just about that. The true love means that we respect all living beings. All living beings. This is where you look outwards. But when you look inwards, when you look at ourselves, we love ourselves. But that's not selfish love, right? True love is not selfish. It is the respect that we pay to our inner nature, and that is not equivalent to selfish. So, how do we love then? Well, how do we do that? If we formally define the method to practice the principle of love, then it is the principle of reciprocity. The principle of reciprocity. In Analects, there is a short passage between Duke Ling of Wei and Zigong and Confucius about reciprocity. And Confucius defined reciprocity like this. He said, "What you do not want done to yourself, do not do it to others." Well, that's very simple, right? And you might think, well, that's that's a simple idea. Even a child knows it. But I think that's exactly the point, isn't it? Because most of the time, adults who rule the world forget the basics. Now, when we consider Confucius' theory, we think of the word benevolence, and as you will see in the course, not today, but in the actual course, the Chinese characters. In Chinese characters, the word benevolence is a picture of two people, right? Two people, not one, but two. So, and that's right, because society is formed by gathering people, and society is the foundation of human survival as well. Xunzi has a lot to say about this as well. Now, the benevolence and reciprocity are therefore the natural law that hold society together. So these concepts, reciprocity, benevolence, they're not made up concepts. They're the natural law that holds society together, right? None of it is arbitrary or man-made. It's just part of the nature. Now you may wonder, all right, what does it have to do with economics, right? Why is reciprocity important to economic development? Well, I don't know the age groups of our audience today, but you will see when if you ask your parents or your friend, about 15 years ago, we experienced one of the most devastating global financial crisis since the Great Depression of 1929. I certainly didn't experience 1929. I hope you realize that. So the crisis led to a countless corporate bankruptcy. Countless people lost their lifetime savings, and many people committed suicide. I was sitting across Lehman Brothers building, and during the day, when it went bankrupt, basically, and witnessing my colleagues in the industry leaving the building. Now, according to my experience as a former banker and researcher later on, many people blame the failure of the risk model, as the cause of the crisis. And experts have, pointed out that, the models used unrealistic assumptions about correlation between volatility and things like that. And they also shown that the unsustainable business model in the housing market. So, pretty much mathematics, math-based solution. Okay. Well, so what do we do then? What do we do? What is our solution to this? Well, we can probably change the business model, right? We can restrict all of the off-balance sheet financing of big banks. We could even ban the creation of all the demonized mortgage-backed securities. We can reverse, in the case of the UK, we can reverse Gordon Brown's light touch approach. And actually we did, and scrutinize every single trade, perhaps. Or, better yet, we can go back to the early 20th century and shut down the global financial market altogether. We can do that. Now, some of you may say, well, that's, these are crazy ideas. No. These are crazy. But the even crazier idea, okay, is that very few people have realized that the cause of the problem is the complete overlook of the principle of reciprocity. Now, take securitization as an example. The derivatives, they are good invention. They're not bad, right? They're good invention. They're neutral, basically. They provide liquidity to banks. They give extra source of fixed income investment opportunity to ordinary people like you and I. So it's supposed to be a win-win situation. But the consideration of reciprocity was lost somewhere along the line, and greediness took over. The once friendly product eventually became toxic. I mean, I guarantee you, if you ask any traders, all right, go back in history and you ask any traders, can you value these products? Do you understand them? And there's a more important question. Would you put your own saving, would your own lifetime saving into these products? Would you do that? The answer is no, absolutely not. Well, then how can people sell them to pensioners and the old people if you don't want to put your own money into it, right? So the answer, I think, is very clear now. We don't stand in the shoes of others when we design financial policies or economic policies. Now, I mean, don't get me wrong. We bound to make mistakes, right? We're not asking for a perfect society. No economic model is perfect, and nobody can foresee the potential, all the potential risks. But that's not the issue. That's not the problem. You see, the extreme peace stage mentioned by Confucius does not exclude the possibility of a rainy day or the outbreak of a pandemic, right? It doesn't exclude any of those problems. But the use of the principle of reciprocity and benevolence in our daily job is completely under our control. This is what we can do. So to sum up, this course is, is not looking to solve all the problems, but simply to give an alternative way to think about economics and about making money. Okay, a different way of thinking about it. And I think the policymakers, the modern policymakers, should really take the ancient teachings seriously, because great honor should come with great responsibility. And I cannot emphasize this more. We don't expect all the economic agents, which are ordinary people like you and I, to understand the principle of love and reciprocity in their daily economic decision makings. You know, they don't need, I mean, they should, but they don't need to do it perfectly, but policymakers must do, or at least the best they can, policymakers. And apart from the technicalities and, you know, mathematical simulations and things like that, the policymakers must consider the aspect of human nature. So, as we'll see in this traditional Chinese classics, much of the content is also centered around the discussion between the sages and the emperors, you know, or the kings. This is because the kings and emperors had much to learn from these sages, right? As Kelly earlier pointed out, and I think this is the same for our modern policymakers. And that's it. This is my introduction about the cause. Any question, you can torture me later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Liu, for showing us how traditional Chinese philosophy can offer solutions to modern day economic affairs. We'll now have 10 to 15 minutes for questions. If you have a question, you may raise your hand or type your question into the chat window. Please feel free to raise your hand or type your question into the chat window.
Hello, Xinghui, can you hear me?
Oh, hi, Suyun.
Okay. First of all, thanks so much for all the lecturers of this afternoon seminar. All the talk are so impressive and interesting. And I have a question to ask Professor Zhu. That is, you know, I'm really curious about how to reconstruct the ancient Chinese language. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. It's true, the topic of reconstruction, it is really very important. I believe you are right. The reconstruction of ancient Chinese sounds is more complicated than alphabetic languages because the pronunciations of Chinese characters are not directly marked. However, there are still some traces of ancient Chinese sounds that remain in ancient texts, just like the reconstruction of ancient creatures. Archaeologists and biologists could reconstruct the dinosaurs based on the fossils buried in different layers under the earth, and then rebuild a Jurassic Park in the movie of modern times. Have you ever watched this famous and interesting movie before? I believe you did. Similarly, linguists can reconstruct ancient Chinese songs according to documentary records of the different historical period, along with the rules of phonetic evolution. When we follow certain principles, I believe it is not difficult to reconstruct the ancient Chinese pronunciation. So if you have opportunity to meet with Confucius and talk with him in the language of old Chinese, I don't think it will be a big problem. Once you have the ability to talk freely with Confucius, then you will not have any difficulty in reading the ancient classics, because all the classics were written by the language of old Chinese. How do we carry out the reconstruction of the ancient sound system? For example, the language of Confucius' time is generally called Archaic Chinese or Old Chinese. We can find many clues of Archaic Chinese sounds. through abundant materials, such as phonetic elements of 形声字 phonetic compounds, which is the basic structure of Chinese characters. And we can also find lots of 假借字, borrowed characters in ancient texts, in which Chinese characters are used as phonetic symbols. Regarding the sound of Xuanzang Dashi, Master Xuanzang's time, which is considered the Middle Chinese, there is also much documents which remains the traces of Middle Chinese pronunciation. For instance, Fan Qie method of phonetic notation, rhyme tables, and the rhyme dictionaries, and so on. Okay, sorry, we have not enough time to talk about the detail of your question. Anyway, thanks for your care about this subject. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zhu.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Siyun. Next, we have a second question from Elliot Cohen. I believe this question is for Dr. Liu. Do you think we overemphasize economics over ethics? Our obsession with GDP doesn't appear sustainable.
All right, thank you, Elliot, for the question. It's a very important question, I believe, and I think if we think about this, we could apply the law of variety that we mentioned earlier. First of all, there is no set answer as to are we emphasizing one over the other. It only changes given the circumstance. For example, when Confucius went to the state of Wei with one of his students, Zigong, okay, and so Zigong, looked around and said, "Well, there's a lot of people in this place. So, master, what should we do?" And the master said, "Well, we should enrich them. In modern term, we should teach them how to make money, how to make a living, right? How to grow crops, how to trade, right? How to enrich their livelihood." That's the first thing. He doesn't even talk about teaching or ethics or anything like that. Let's make them rich first. Let's make sure that they can eat, put the food on the table, put the clothes on their body. That's the first thing. And then Zigong asked, "What should we do then?" And the master said, "We should teach them. We should educate them." And that is, of course, about ethics. So you see, it really depends on where we are. And at the moment, I think the answer is yes, we are overemphasizing economics over ethics, because we sort of, we forgot why are we making money in the first place. We just keep making it because it seems the right thing to do. I think, if I may take about 2 minutes, I think Xun Zi gave a very good explanation about this, right? And to answer this question, we need to trace back to the very origin, why are we making money in the first place? So he said, right? He said, let me just find it for you. So is it at the beginning, right? At the beginning of the society, people, men are not as strong as animals, right? Men do not have claws or sharp teeth, and not the same level of physical strength as animals. But man can survive and change the nature because men stay together. Men form a society. And to form a society, man must love each other. Otherwise, there is no such a thing as society, right? But then, because resources are limited, so as man explore the nature, they realize that there isn't enough left. So what they do is that they need a virtuous leader or a wise person or a sage, right, to lead them, to teach them, to bring harmony into the society. And this is where we sort of shift focus from emphasis on GDP, if you like, to ethics, because without ethics, society will fall apart. Okay, so I think that it's a life cycle of society that when we focus too much on GDP or making money, we technology is not catching up, so efficiency is not catching up, production not catching up. So what do? Well, let's go to war with somebody, right? Let's fight somebody and take their stuff, and then later on, people saying, well, that's not sustainable. Let's go back to ethics, because economy has been destroyed, and then the cycle continues. Okay, I think at the moment we are in a very funny stage of society where we are forgetting. We're forgetting the whole reason of economic development. Okay, we just want more than we can chew. Now, in this course, we also look at why we consume. What is the point of consumption? I mean, everything needs to be driven by ethics. And we're not saying that making money is wrong. It is the right thing to do. Is the rightful thing to do? We must. We have to provide for our children, for our for elders, for all the rest of the society. But we need to know why we are doing this, right? And make sure that our inner nature is not contaminated by wants and desire. So then we can maintain a balance between GDP and ethics. But if you look at the modern, this is the problem. If you look at modern textbooks, business schools, whatever, there is no mentioning about ethics. People seem to treat it as a completely different subject. It's even taught in a different school, in a different faculty, right? There is a business school and there is a sociology department. They don't talk to each other. That is wrong. That leads to all the problems that we're seeing today, I think. I hope it answers your question, Elliot. But thanks for that. Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Liu, and for the question. Next, we have a question from Alex Chen. Thank you to all the speakers and organizers. I have a question related to children's primers. How can we bring the rhyming and entertainment aspect of something like 弟子规 into other languages like English? Do you think rhyming is necessary in translations for them to become widely recited and used? So could we invite Catherine to answer this question? Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much for the question. It's a very good question because that is something that we are facing if we are going to translate these texts. As I said, it is one of my great hopes and vision that these texts can be made available for an international audience. And for that to happen, then it does have to be translated. So yes, when we translate, there are certain elements of translating. It's not just sort of a word for word translating. You do want to ensure that the aesthetics are maintained. So in terms of ensuring that you have that entertaining aspect that we talked about so that other children around the world can also enjoy it, there are several aspects. Yes, it would be best if there was rhyme, rhythm still in the translation, and for something like the 1,000-character essay, 千字文, that has been translated, many people have tried to recreate the rhythm and rhyme. For example, Herbert Giles, one of a very famous British sinologist. So yes, people have tried to do that. I guess the other thing your question made me reflect on is that it's in some ways like the original text, these classics, they need to be explained. And as I've probably through the talk today, you might have noticed that there's a lot of sort of background or stories that are, behind those very simple, maybe 6 characters. And so that really needs to be explained, that needs to be provided to international audiences as well. So it's not so much just the rhyme and rhythm, but also the stories. I think that's really where the gold is, where if you can provide those stories, you can translate those stories and attach them either as annotations or as part of a picture book, then that would also maintain that entertainment aspect as well. So I guess in terms of what Chinese compilers have done with ensuring that it is entertaining, yes, they've used rhyme rhythm, but the classical allusions with the stories behind those words, that was something that was a new technique from around the 15th century onwards, more primers with allusions. So I think that's something that we also need to work on if we're going to make it available for an international audience. Rhyme, rhythm, the stories. And then the last thing I thought about was the idea of applicability. So things like the 弟子规, 常例举要, the best thing is if they're made practical. So it's not so much translating word for word, but translating what needs to be done and why. And then when people or when children can put it into practice, that is also really fun. For example, 常例举要 has a whole section on meals. So what to do together when you're eating together. And, if you can recreate that space, recreate those instructions, then children follow that. It's not about memorizing those words. It's about knowing what to do in that situation. So I guess 4 things, rhyme, rhythm, the stories, and the applicability. I think those are the key things that we need to keep and try to keep if we're going to make it available internationally in these translated works. But thank you again for your question.
Thank you, Catherine. Last but not least, we have a question from Ruiping Chu. Professor Chu just mentioned that the translation of Buddhist scripture gave a great influence to the ancient Chinese phonology. Could you please tell us how it happened?
Okay, thank you. The translation of the Buddhist scriptures, which began in the East Han Dynasty, lasted over 800 years. During the period, Chinese scholars and many monks were fully exposed to Sanskrit, which is a Vedic language. They also sufficiently understood the principles of phonetics and phonology. Then, many Chinese monks applied such linguistic knowledge to the analysis of the pronunciation of Chinese characters. Thereby, the earliest 36 Chinese alphabet, 字母, was designed, in which each Chinese character was used as a phonetic symbol. In addition, they designed the rhyme tables, which is an ancient sound chart of Chinese characters. All this knowledge contributed to the understanding of Chinese sound system. From then on, the Chinese people knew how the pronunciations of Chinese characters were put together. The use of such knowledge also promoted the development of Chinese poetic rhyme and rhythm and formed the glorious age of Tang poetry, Tang Shi. Furthermore, we can read the translation of Buddhist scriptures more easily today by the better understanding of Middle Chinese. Many thanks for your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chu, and thank you for all the questions and answers. Given the time, we'll now have to bring the Q&A session to an end. Now, please welcome the Provost to give his closing remarks.
Thank you, Xinhui. Today's seminars have presented a taste of the diversity of ideas and insight to be gained from the ancient Chinese thinkers and their texts. We have heard much about Confucius, Mencius, and other sages and scholars. Many of these Chinese texts have been studied for thousands of years. Learners in each generation have sought to learn from them. We know from their interpretations that they discovered from the timeless words new meaning and truths for their times and made the text their own. The tradition of learning began with Confucius, who is thought to have edited various classics like the Classic of Changes to transmit the teachings for the state and society of his times. At the heart of Confucius' teachings is a dream that society is led by the wise and virtuous, that honesty and neighborliness are upheld, and that all people love and care for their parents and children, as well as those of others, so that the aged are cherished, the adults can contribute their strengths, and that the children are educated to realize their potential. And the disadvantaged, whether widows, orphans, childless, or diseased, are all supported. This dream is recorded in the classic called Record of a Ritual, and it has been shared by countless generations of learners. As I mentioned earlier, we have the books like the complete library of the 4 branches of Chinese literature. But just as important as the books is having the people to read them. People able to read, teach, and translate these great collections so that the wisdom and learning can be shared. As a first step, the seminars invite us to think and reflect on our everyday patterns of life and work. They challenge us to put into practice what we've learned in terms of character cultivation, to think about how we can contribute our knowledge and skills to our family, friends, and community, to cultivate friendships that can strengthen our ethical character and bring out our innate goodness, to live with a family reverence and cherish our parent, to realize our love and respectfulness for those around us in daily act of thoughtfulness, and to nurture our sprout of a virtue, and to focus on what we can do for others. The seminars today provide a taste of the themes and text that will form part of our new English Bachelor program. Do contact us if you know someone who might be interested. We are grateful to all the organizers and the presenters for their efforts in making this program possible. Our heartfelt thanks to each and every one of you for joining us. May you all enjoy peace, health, and happiness always. Thank you.
Thank you, Provost. This concludes our 2-day Sinology Art of Living seminars. We hope the sessions have provided you with new perspectives on how Sinology can enrich our lives. Thank you all for joining us. We hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.